There we go. So I'm going to tell you about my dissertation research. First, oh, first is a variety of fishes that go onto land. You got intertidal sculpins, snakeheads, walking catfish, gobies, mud skippers, bikers, eels, blunnies, killifish, and a whole bunch of other species on fish that go onto land. They all have some things in common, though. They have adaptations for terrestrial life. They need to be able to do things on land well. One of these adaptations that's in a lot of the species is air-breathing adaptations. For example, this is the air-breathing organ of a walking catfish. These are the gills you're looking at, and the suprabranchial organ. So they have this highly branching, high surface area, highly vascularized organ above their gills for aerial gas exchange. And also, fish need to avoid drying up. So they avoid desiccation, but like the mud skippers, by rolling around the mud or just generally staying near bodies of water. You also need to be able to move around on land. It's not as simple as just swimming on land because they don't have the buoyant force of water supporting their body weight, so they need to support their own body weight under gravity, and they don't have the viscous force to help them propel through the water. So here's an example of some fish on land moving around. It'll take a second for the video to come up. So here you'll see some mud skippers doing a crutching behavior with their pectoral fins, where they're moving themselves along. They're also doing a prone jumping behavior. So they're using multiple locomotors to move around, and other fish move around in different ways on land, which I'll touch a little bit on later on. So the goals of my dissertation were to figure out, why do amphibious fishes go onto land? How do they move around while on land? And where do they go on land? How do they orient? What goals are they going towards? So I'm going to focus on the first point first. So fish come onto land for a variety of reasons. Some, like the mangrove revelis, come onto land because of poor water quality. There's too much hydrogen sulfide, which is a toxic noxious compound in the water. They will leave the water. These fish will also leave the water if the temperature gets too hot, and they'll go onto land for evaporative cooling. Or if the salinity is not ideal, they'll also emerge. Other species, like California grunion, will emerge onto land to spawn en masse under the light of the full moon, away from aquatic predators. You also have eel catfish, a type of air-breathing catfish that'll come onto land to feed on terrestrial invertebrates like this beetle. But every fish is different. You have to look at them on a species-by-species basis. For example, these California grunions don't go onto land to feed. So I want to focus on another group of species that has been understudied in terms of their immersion in terrestrial behaviors. Snakeheads, Chanidae. They have an air-breathing organ similar to the walking catfish organ that I showed earlier, which allows them to survive for up to a day out of water. And they're native to stagnant waters in Southeast Asia that can often build up a lot of decomposing material, which cause harmful water quality. And they're also in areas prone to flooding that could spread them out into shallow waters that will then recede, stranding them on land. There have been some studies that have attempted to describe snakehead terrestrial locomotion, but those have been very scarce and included very little detail. The most detailed account of their terrestrial behavior is probably this Walt Disney cartoon about the snakehead. Vicious and ferocious, the Asiatic snakehead, a true fish, cannot abide any other fishes in the same pond with him. He destroys each one, but he doesn't suffer from his own greed and destructiveness. He simply wriggles over land to the next likely looking pond. So that's about as detailed as any manuscript has been so far. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the northern snakehead, Chana argus. It is invasive to US, particularly around the Potomac region, but also has established populations in New York, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and recently they established themselves in the Mississippi River in Arkansas, so expect to see them everywhere soon. And these are harmful because they eat native species, outcompete native predators, and they've harmed some people, where I know of a fisherman who lost a thumb to a snakehead biting it off. The range expansion seems to increase around flooding events, though, as you have a flood that perhaps can help them disperse through shallow water, and then they can, when the floods recede, they get stranded on land and can move around to another body of water. There's also conflicting evidence for terrestrial behaviors. Some people say they go onto land, but most of the accounts of this are just from fishermen dropping them on the ground and saying, look, it's wriggling away. There hasn't been an actual concrete evidence saying that these can move well over land. And despite this, there are numerous horror movies, awful, entertaining horror movies of snakeheads coming onto land and eating people. So I wanted to separate fact from fiction and see, do snakeheads even go onto land? First step to test this was immersion experiments, where I had these plastic shoe boxes filled with water and ramps that go through the surface of the water to allow snakeheads that were individually placed in these containers to emerge onto those ramps if they so felt inclined, and expose them to a variety of treatments that some of them may be extreme, but they are within the realm of possibility that these fish will experience in the wild. And of all these treatments, that only 3 elicited immersion: saltwater, low pH, and high dissolved carbon dioxide. So here you can see a snakehead emerging, trying to get its sensitive gills out of the water because of low pH that can be harmful to the gills. And so these treatments are something that they can actually experience. You can have high levels of saltwater in coastal bodies of freshwater, where you could have saltwater intrusion, or at the brackish end of a river, or even you can have a coastal pond or lake that gets filled with salt water during an extraordinarily high tide, such as during a hurricane. Low pH and high dissolved carbon dioxide can also build up in these stagnant bodies of water where there's a lot of rotting vegetation. And these are actually environments that snakeheads often prefer, or the most commonly found in. So this is something that they may experience regularly. So we found that yes, snakeheads will come onto land under some conditions, mostly under poor water conditions. Now, what about other fish? Because every fish is different. This is the walking catfish. It is another invasive species. It's mostly invasive in Florida, but also found throughout the world in other areas. They eat native species, and they are pests to aquaculture fish farmers. Many other air-breathing catfishes exhibit amphibious behaviors. These are called walking catfish because they're known for walking. But you also have the nocturnal terrestrial feeding catfish, such as the eel catfish I showed you earlier feeding on a beetle. And these are only thought to emerge around heavy rains, but we don't really know that for sure, and we don't know if they come out onto land for other conditions. So to figure this out, I did a survey on walking catfish terrestrial natural history. I developed a series of questions for people who've actually seen walking catfish on land, such as about the weather, time of day, location, and all these aspects around these sightings. Overall, I got 88 responses from Florida wildlife related Facebook groups. And I also combined this information with 38 YouTube videos that I analyzed for information like, is it raining in the background? Is it sunny? Is it dry on the ground? What time of year was this video posted? Things like that. Overall, here's all the data. I'm going to go through it graph by graph. So sometimes these catfish will emerge as individuals or in groups of over 100. Doesn't seem to be any clear pattern there. And same with grouping. Sometimes they're solitary, sometimes they're scattered, sometimes they're clustered. Most of the observations were during the day, but there was also some at night and dawn and dusk. So they're not only coming out at day. And most observations were when it was wet out and when it was raining, but there was still some observations while it was dry and sunny. Most observations were during the rainy season, which is late spring to early fall in Florida, but some were in winter. Most observations occurred by a lot on concrete. Most of these were in sidewalks and roads, parking lots, but also some were on grass and soil. A lot of these observations were nowhere near bodies of water. At least like nobody saw visible bodies of water nearby. Like sometimes people would describe them as appearing out of nowhere in the middle of a Payless Shoes parking lot in Lakeland, Florida. That was a hot spot for walking catfish sightings. Now this needs to be taken with a grain of salt. There is some observer bias. You have fewer people going into the woods at night during hurricanes to look for walking catfish, but we can still draw some generalizations about this. So here are some other noteworthy specific survey results. So 17 observations were of catfish directly entering or exiting storm drain, which could possibly explain how they are appearing out of nowhere in these parking lots. You have, Florida is unlike other states in that it doesn't really have topography. So there's no water, there's no gravity to move the water downhill. Instead, it relies on water pressure to continuously push water comes in. And because of that, there's always standing water, and there's fish in that standing water, which luckily Florida is Florida. And so you can do a YouTube search and there's tons of people fishing in storm drains, catching fish, demonstrating that there is actually fish living down there. So it seems like they may be taking advantage of flooding conditions, swimming out of storm drains to disperse, and perhaps coming back in the storm drains or dispersing to overland to new bodies of water when the rain and water recedes. You also have, there was one observation by a USGS wildlife technician who saw many catfish on a flooded road surrounded by a bunch of annelid earthworms. He collected about 50 of them to bring home and eat, and he found that half of those had worms in their stomachs. So it seems like these fish were coming onto land to feed on these submerged terrestrial invertebrates. Additionally, there was a professional fishing guide, I think Mark Benson is on right now, who observed about 18 catfish moving in a tightly crusted group, leaving a pond on a sunny day. They moved directly upwind about 40 meters to a cypress mound with standing water below it that was initially out of view. So perhaps they're able to detect some volatile compound coming from that body of water, and we're able to follow it upwind to the cypress mound. So we figured out why do amphibious fishes go onto land. Now let's move on to how do they move around on land. So we found out the snakeheads will go onto land when water quality is poor, but can they actually effectively move over land? If so, how do they do it? And does substrate impact their performance? To test if they can effectively move over land, with the help of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, I collected a bunch of snakeheads over a wide size range from Potomac River tributaries through electrofishing, and I filmed them on a variety of surfaces. I use bench liner, which is a flat, smooth paper towel-like substrate that we put onto stone. Also use grass because you can see that is the natural shoreline that they may emerge onto. We use artificial turf because it's a more homogeneous version of grass that we can bring into the lab. And we filmed them on the rubber boat deck right here, which had little grippers, both while the boat was flat and while the boat was tilted by having us move to the side of the boat to see if tilting had an impact on their performance, see if having a slope impacts performance. To determine the kinematics, we use landmark tracking software in MATLAB, which basically tracked the tip of the snout, the center of mass, and the tip of the tail, frame by frame through the videos, so we can see exactly where, how each body part is moving. And this allows us to determine a few different things, like distance ratio, which is the net distance over the total distance traveled. So a distance ratio close to 0 would mean you're moving side to side a lot while going forward relatively little, whereas a distance ratio of 1 means you're going in a straight line with no side to side movement. We're also able to determine stride frequency, how quickly are these behaviors happening, and velocity, how quickly are they actually moving. So first of all, it seems like snakeheads can effectively move over land. Here are some snakeheads on some bench liner being filmed overhead, and you can see it is moving forward. It's not breaking any speed barriers, speed records, but it is moving using a form of axial appendage-based terrestrial locomotion using its body, its tail, and its pectoral fins. And you can even see a trackway of slime in the bench liner. Interesting to note that they're not lifting their bodies off of the substrate. They're pushing their body along. And this is different from the tide pool sculpin, which actively rolls over its pectoral fins and lifts its center of mass over the ground and alternately lifts and plants its pectoral fins. The snakehead may not be able to do this simply because of a matter of scaling. They may be too large to support their own weight on their soft pectoral fin rays and may have to rely on a different way to move around on land. To figure out exactly what's happening with the pectoral fins and the muscles, we did electromyography or EMG. We had 12 muscles implanted with electrodes per fish, and these included the left and right abductor and adductor muscles, the muscles that protract and retract the pectoral fin, as well as the anterior and posterior hypaxial and epaxial muscles. These are the fish fillet muscles, the bodies that go all along the side that are primarily used for swimming. Now, we filmed multiple individuals for multiple turf crawl sequences to get as much data as we could. And we used Acknowledge software to sync the videos of these movements with the recordings of the muscle patterns to see exactly what's happening when these muscles are activating. There were some limitations of the software though, and because of the sampling rate, we could only record 6 muscles at a time, which were chosen at random. And so we patched these muscles together to determine the overall muscle activity pattern, which looks like this. Here you can see on the bottom, it starts at 0% and 100%. So 100% of one stride is 0% the next stride. So this is a cyclical behavior that we arbitrarily decided to start at the right anterior hypaxial muscle because they had the most recordings. The white numbers reflect the number of recordings we had, number of sequences we recorded for each muscle. The thick bars are the average start and end times of muscle activation, and the thin bars are the standard error. So overall, you can see there's a left-right activation pattern in the axial muscles, which is what to be expected in an oscillatory behavior. Something to note about the pectoral fins, though, that they are a little out of phase, which is what you would expect. Otherwise, the fins wouldn't be doing anything because the muscles would be working antagonistically. Interesting to note, though, that unlike the hyposculpin, which is using each pectoral fin once per full stride cycle, the snakeheads are using them up to 2 times, but not always. So it seems like they have some plasticity in their locomotor behavior, and they're using the pectoral fins perhaps to enable that plasticity. And so they're not rolling onto the pectoral fins like the sculpins, but perhaps they're using them for something else. So here you can see again on the bench liner, it's using its pectoral fins roughly at the same time, twice per stride, and it's not moving that far. But on grass, these are actually able to move a lot more quickly. And same as on the boat deck with the rubber grippers. They may be able to take advantage of the 3-dimensionality of the substrate to get a better purchase and move more effectively over land. So you can see clearly there is a difference of substrate, but what is that difference? I did a Mankova test to determine these differences, and overall there's a significant effect of substrate and body length on performance. Instead of going piece by piece for the entire Mankova results, I'll just give you a couple examples. For example, velocity increases with body length. As you can see, as they get bigger, the velocity increases, but it also increases with substrate. So you have in benchliner on blue, they are not moving as fast as on the 3-dimensional grass in red. Distance ratio also increases with slope, but not length. So you can see here that the distance ratio is, again, a measure of the effectiveness of how they move across land. It's staying constant throughout the body, throughout the entire size range. But when you have a sloped substrate, like the tilted boat deck, they're moving more effectively than on the flat substrate. There's also an ontogenic shift in behavior in the snakeheads. They switched from a jump to a crawl, specifically a tail flip jump, which is a caudally oriented jump that puts them in a ballistic flight path. And this is a common locomotor behavior used by amphibious killifish and minnows and other fish on land. So it seems like these fish that jumped were all 3.5 centimeters and smaller, whereas the ones that crawled were all 4.5 centimeters and larger. So somewhere in that size range is they are shifting to this behavior, perhaps because the crawling becomes more effective, or perhaps because there's a morphological shift, but further research is needed to figure that out. So overall, snakeheads will emerge under poor environmental conditions, particularly low pH, high carbon dioxide, and high salinity. They use a form of axial appendage-based terrestrial locomotion when they're larger and tail flipping when they're smaller. Having a larger size improves performance, but also having a slope and a 3-dimensional substrate also improves performance. And because they can breathe air on land, they'll voluntarily emerge under some conditions. Voluntarily emerge under some conditions and use axial they'll emerge voluntarily under some conditions. They will use axial appendage-based terrestrial locomotion to move effectively over land, and they can breathe air. They have the potential to move and disperse over land. And so for some reason it seems like this may time out in 10 minutes. If that's the case, we will restart the same Zoom link. This didn't happen in practice, but we're going to go with it. So snakeheads aren't the only invasive amphibious fish to go onto land. These the plecos are also an invasive fish. Plecos, suckermouth armored catfishes, whatever you want to call them, these are the suckerfish that stick to the glass in most aquarium tanks. These are invasive in Florida. So these are invasive in Florida, but these are not known to go on to land, but they can breathe air through their gut. So I want to see, can invasive plecos move over land? If so, how do they do it? How low do they move? And does their armored morphology affect their terrestrial locomotion? They have, it may be hidden under their patterns, but they have thick armor, and that may restrict their flexibility and perhaps have effects on their locomotion. Now, do different species perform differently? So these look very similar, but they're actually two different species. And so they may look very similar and they act very similar. So I want to see, do they perform similarly? So here you can see a pleco moving around on a piece of styrofoam in a kiddie pool. It's using a form of actual appendage-based terrestrial locomotion using its pelvic fins, pectoral fins, caudal fins, and mouth. It is a highly asymmetric behavior. You can see it's moving its tail a lot more to one side than the other. And they're actually able to reach bursts of over 1 meter per second, which is about as fast as any fish can go. So you can see I'm filming from the side with my iPhone, and here's what that looks like. You can see that the fish are using a coordinated movements of their pelvic and pectoral fins to move around on land. And here's another view of fish on a frustrated total internal reflection table, which basically just highlights, lights up any part of the body that's in contact with the substrate. So here you can see that they lift their mouth up, fling their tail forward, they plant their mouth down, and then they protract the left pectoral and pelvic fins right here. Let's show that again. And then they raise their mouth again, and then fling their tail forward. So it's very asymmetric, and here's some graphs showing what's exactly happening. On the y-axis is the frame number, and first graph you can overall see that the left fins are paired with the right fins. The second graph shows the curvature coefficient, which is a measure of how close the head and tail are to each other. And so depending on which side of the body, their head and tail are getting closer to each other on one side and further than the other side, showing how asymmetric this is. On the bottom, when the bars are shown, that means that body part is in contact with the ground. And you can see that the right pectoral and pelvic fins are in contact with the substrate the entire time, along with the abdomen. The tail is actually not in contact with the substrate at all, but they have a coordinated pattern of their left pectoral and pelvic fins and their mouth. So it seems like they're coordinating the movements of their mouth, one half of their body, and their tail, which they're flinging forward, but they're not actually using against the ground. And because it's so different from like a crawl or a walk or punting or any other terrestrial locomotor behavior, we had to create a new term to describe it, to call reffling or repetitive flinging. So does morphology constrain or enhance reffling? So here's a CT scan of the plecos, at least one of the species of plecos. You can see here is the head, and you're looking at partially sliced in through the body. Here is the vertebral column. In blue, you have the pelvic girdle with the pelvic fin rays. And in this bone is an unusual bone that's only found in this group of catfish called a lateropterygium. It connects the pelvic girdle to the armor, which then connects to the axial skeleton. And so there seems to be a rigid connection between the pelvic girdle and the axial skeleton, which may improve force transmission to the ground to improve terrestrial performance. But the lateropterygium also restricts forward motion of the pelvic fins, so they can't move the fins that far forward. They also have a locking mechanism in their pectoral fin, which prevents their pectoral fins as well as their pelvic fins from moving that far forward. You have another species of fish, though, Cryptotora thamicola, which has convergently evolved a connection from its pelvic girdle to its axial skeleton. So here's axial skeleton, pelvic girdle, pelvic fin rays, and here's a rib that's going down. So it's not a lateropterygium, it's a rib connecting their pelvic girdle to their vertebral column. And so this is convergent evolution, but it's not homologous structures. So they have both separately evolved these structures that may improve force transmission to the ground. However, both of these fish are able to move well over the ground. And for comparison, here's a goldfish that doesn't move on the ground and has no connection between its pelvic girdle and its axial skeleton. Here's another view of the plecos. When you take the skin off of a dead specimen, you can see between the pelvic fins, there's a lot of red muscle. And red muscle is indicative of a lot of slow oxidative fibers, which are the endurance fibers. So these fish are built for endurance rather than speed, which may help them move long distances over land. Here's another view of their CT scan. This is the dorsal fin up top in blue, and the pterygophores coming down from the dorsal fin. You also have the vertebral column in salmon color, and you have these paraneural arches coming up in a Y shape that interlock with the pterygophores. And so this interlocking may further restrict lateral movement, but also again improve force transmission. I must note that further down on the body, past the dorsal fin, these fish actually have just single neural spines instead of Y-shaped paraneural spines. And so this may explain why they're more flexible in their posterior tail region. So overall, morphology restricts and enhances. Their body and their fins have restricted range of motion due to armor and various bony connections, but these connections can improve force transmission. And so while being restricted, they may actually be constrained into only being able to move on land in such a weird way, but they can do it so well because of their rigid connections. And they have the muscles built for endurance to help them reffle long periods of time over land. Now, can these fish sustain reffling for dispersal? So overall, here you can see with each sequence number for all the species, all 4 species, the performance declines after repeated reffles. So they are tiring after they move long distances. But does each species perform similarly? Yeah, pretty much. So overall, the species perform very similarly in almost all aspects. Just a couple examples, you can see that the snout distance ratio is about the same for all species, as well as relative velocity. There is a difference, though, in the endurance levels of these species. These fish have, so here on the x-axis are different species. On the y-axis, you have the slope of the velocity changing per sequence. So it's essentially like acceleration. So having it near 0 means you're not slowing down or speeding up. Having it less than 0 means you're slowing down, and more than 0 means you're speeding up over time. So these species have different levels of endurance rate, which is interesting to note considering how similar they are looking. So overall, plecos, despite being morphologically constrained, they can move quite well. They use reffling, a novel form of terrestrial locomotion. Their performance declines over time, but at different rates for different species. And higher endurance species can spread farther over land. This means that they have the potential to disperse over land farther. And therefore, we should prioritize preventing the establishment of higher performing pleco species from establishing invasive populations. There are hundreds of species of plecos in the aquarium trade, all of which could easily enter into non-native bodies of water, which they have done in many parts around the world. So prioritizing the better performing species from establishing invasive populations may be more effective in preventing widespread dispersal of this invasive species. So we figured out how do they move around on land. Now we're going to go into where they go on land and how do they orient. And I should be getting cut off in less than a minute, in which case we will restart the Zoom and hopefully that same Zoom link will work. So most fish's senses don't work on land. Olfactory bulbs collapse in air, so they're not able to breathe and take in air while they're on land. Sorry, not able to smell and take in air on land. Their odorless vestibular system, or their inner ear, gives them information of position on a slope. So they can learn if they're on a tilted ground. And fish have been shown to orient downhill, but what about navigating? So most fish senses don't work on land. You have olfactory bulbs that collapse in air, and they're not able to ventilate air, so they're not able to bring in and out these different air to be able to smell their environment. The odorless vestibular system, or the inner ear of the fish, gives them information of their position on a slope. A previous study showed that fish will orient downhill, but what about navigation? They'll make their first jump downhill, but will they continuously move and reorient downhill? Now, vision functions in air, but not as well. So think of it when you go underwater and open your eyes without goggles, you can see things, they're blurry, you can see colors, rough shapes, but that's probably what the fish see out of water due to the differences in the refractive index of the media. So our eyes are adapted for air, their eyes are adapted more for water, and so they probably see what we see but they probably see out of water what we see underwater. Now here is a mummy chug. It is I did my undergraduate research. It's a type of killifish. And these are intertidal fish that will move around on land. And they do so, and they orient using vision. It's interesting to note that they do a tail flip jump like the snakeheads, and they jump from their side, they land on their lateral side, and then they do an uprighting behavior, which I'll show you right here, before doing a consecutive jump. So doing this uprighting behavior, it seems functionally unnecessary to perform 2 consecutive jumps. But I believe by uprighting, they improve their vision by having their eyes not one looking in the ground, but one looking in the sky, by having their eyes allowing them to give a good lay of the land. And so this uprighting behavior allows them to use vision to see the water and move towards it. And they move towards the water by looking for the most reflective surface in their environment, which is usually water in intertidal systems. So I wanted to see, do other amphibious fishes use vision to orient towards water on reflective surfaces while on land? Are there other visual cues used in orientation other than strong reflections? And do other senses like the otolith vestibular system play a role in terrestrial orientation navigation? To test this out, I used the species, the mangrove rivulus, Cryptolebius marmoratus. It is a killifish just like the mummychugs. It is native to the Caribbean mangrove swamps, where it lives in crab holes and can even be found in moist logs, living there for 2 months at a time. So they're just about as terrestrial as a fish gets. And they're self-fertilizing hermaphrodites that start a life as this drab-colored hermaphrodite that can self-fertilize its own eggs. And then if it gets stressed, it can irreversibly change to an orange-colored male. And so these fish use tail flipping and uprighting behaviors on land similarly to the mummychug, so it makes them a great comparison. So to test out their vision on land, their orientation, I filmed them overhead in this arena where the fish started in a cup in the center, and it was pulled up by a pulley system to avoid affecting their initial jumping direction. And these fish were allowed to move freely until they left this big circle, the extra test area, and at which point we recorded the direction that they crossed this line. There were treatments placed in the extra test area. Shown is foil to see how they orient, and foil is test reflection. We also did 3 controls, a shelter treatment where we put a natural looking aquarium rock shelter over here to see how they respond to novel objects. We use black and white to test basic color contrast. We use a slope by tilting the whole fish tank, the whole kiddie pool. And we use orange to test their color vision and color orientation. We chose orange because the males develop orange coloration, so it's reasonable to assume that this is the color that elicits a strong. If there is a color they respond to on land, it must be orange. The observer stood outside for most of the treatments, but not all of them, and I'll explain that just in a second. So here's an example of one of the treatments, one of the trials. I pull up the cup from a pulley system. The fish is allowed to observe the environment as much as it wants. This happens to be the control experiment, and it should do a jump in a second, and then another jump, and then it'll reorient right there, and then do another tail flip jump, and crossing the line right about here, which is where we would record the direction. Now these open circles are the directions that fish cross the line. So these open circles on these circular plots represent the final direction a fish took to exit the test area. These triangles reflect the average direction of all the fish, and these rose petals are a histogram of all of that data. So for the first control, I noticed that if I stood over here, the fish significantly moved towards the opposite side. So then I went on the opposite side, and the fish moved the exact opposite way. So clearly they were moving away from me, and my presence itself was having an effect on them. So I got a GoPro and did another control experiment, and they move randomly when exposed to the control. When exposed to in this control treatment with the GoPro. So now we can get on to the other treatments because there's nothing in the room affecting their current behavior. Like the mummychugs, these fish move toward the water and toward the foil. And so they're using visual navigation like the mummychugs, specifically looking for reflections to find water or reflective surfaces. The fish actually moved away from shelter, an unfamiliar object. When we placed it over here, the fish moved significantly over here. Now, so it seems like they may have not perceived it as shelter, and they moved away from it as an unknown object, just like they moved away from me because it could potentially be a threat. But some fish that got close to it, the shelter, once they got around here, they would make a beeline and wiggle themselves under the shelter. So it seems like they may be nearsighted. When they're close enough, they can perceive something as shelter, but when they're too far away, even if just like a foot or two, they don't have the visual capacity to make out what it is, and they'll move away from it to be safe. In the black and white treatment, they prefer to move towards the white side, and they suggesting that they prefer lighter color backgrounds. The fish move down slope in the slope treatment, suggesting that they will continuously reorient to move downhill. The fish actually had both a sexually dimorphic response to the color orange and an age response to the color orange. So here you can see the orange quadrant, and the fish showed a strong preference for moving to that quadrant, but it was not a statistically significant preference. But I noticed that while most of the individuals were young, just a few months old, some of them were several years old, and these ones had visible cataracts and their eyes were cloudy, and so perhaps these ones, their vision were impaired. So I reanalyzed this data without those 10 or so individuals. There we go. And the direction was the same, but it reduced some of the noise, and it showed that they significantly moved towards the orange. So they do show a preference of moving towards the orange. But I wanted to break it down even further to see, do the different sexes have different responses? And they do. The hermaphrodites move randomly when exposed to the orange quadrant. But the males significantly move towards the orange. So there is a difference in their, so they are able to determine colors and orient by them, but males show a different motivation than hermaphrodites when orienting on land. So overall, for the mangrove realists, vision is important for terrestrial navigation. Specifically, they use reflection, basic color contrast, and color cues to orient. They'll also move away from perceived threats, whether it's me or a novel object that they don't know. And then water may be used for the orientation, and they may be able to move towards water, it seems like. Different sexes also respond differently to orange coloration, and I have two hypotheses on this. One is that it could be male-male aggression. The orange-colored male sees orange and assumes that that indicates there's a male over there, and so he's going over there to pick a fight with the other male. Or it could be camouflage. They may have some self-awareness of their coloration and be able to camouflage in the environment based on that. In their native environment in mangrove forests, there's a lot of orange, dead orange mangrove leaves on the ground they would be able to camouflage well in. And fish are also able to navigate downhill. They can continuously reorient until they reach the bottom of the hill, where water is most often found rather than at the top of the hill. So the mangrove rivulus and mummy chug both have really large eyes relative to their body, and so suggesting they rely on vision. However, walking catfish have relatively small eyes, but they have big whiskers. They are also chemoreception specialists with the best taste of any vertebrate, and that's because they have extraoral taste buds all over their body, particularly focused on their barbels, also known as whiskers. So I want to see, can walking catfish perhaps orient with chemoreception out of the water? They feed on land, and some species feed particularly on land at night, suggesting vision is probably, with their tiny eyes, is probably not how they find their prey. And one survey respondent also said he saw a group of catfish moving upwind to a distant body of water that was out of initial view. So it seemed like perhaps they were able to detect some volatile compounds and move towards that. So I did a similar setup as with the mangrove rivulus, just on a larger scale because these are larger fish. We placed the fish in the center of a bucket, filled them overhead, and we, for each trial, I replaced the bench liner and plastic sheeting to prevent chemicals and signals from previous fish from affecting the next fish. I did two types of treatments. I did a direct contact orientation treatment, which had one half of the bench liner sprayed with deionized water and had the other half sprayed with a solution of a chemical in deionized water to see if they will respond when in direct contact with these chemicals and orient to them. Also did some distant orientation treatments where we had treatments, both chemical and visual, in the extra test area to see if they will respond to these stimuli that they're not in direct contact with. So first of all, with the deionized water, there's a successful control that moved randomly. So we established that there's nothing in the room that's affecting their orientation. And first, the catfish, we use alanine in the direct orientation treatments. Specifically, we use L-alanine, which is the isomer of alanine that elicits the strongest positive taste response in catfish in the water. So it's reasonable to assume that if they like it in the water, they like it on land, and they do. They significantly move towards it on land. Because it's a taste compound, this confirms that they are using taste to orient on land. But perhaps they are using, they just like to move towards other, just chemicals in general. It's not specific to alanine, they just like their novel chemical. So we use sucrose or sugar. And sucrose is it elicits a neutral response in catfish. They don't really care for sweet things, but they also don't dislike them. It just has a neutral response. And they showed no significant preference in a direction when exposed to sucrose. These fish then were exposed to quinine, which is a strongly bitter taste compound, and they moved randomly when exposed to that. Now, this could be because they simply don't use quinine, bitter compounds for orientation, as they're mostly derived from terrestrial plants. As fish, they have evolved without terrestrial plants usually around them, and so they may not really have a need to orient with respect to bitter compounds. We also tested AITC, which is a nociceptive compound. It's that compound in horseradish and wasabi that causes a burning sensation. When exposed to that, the catfish move randomly as well. Now, this treatment may be a little inconclusive because AITC is very lowly soluble in water. So perhaps they were not even able to detect it through their mucus layer because the mucus is filled with water. And so future experiments can determine their nociceptive capabilities on land. For the distant orientation treatment, we first tested reverse osmosis filtered water, and these fish move randomly when exposed to that. You can see the quadrant up here. But when nothing else changed except replace the filtered water with pond water, they significantly move towards the pond water. So there's something that's in the pond water that's not in the filtered water that they are moving towards. So it could be that they're able to orient distantly to some volatile amino acids or other volatile compounds coming from the pond water and are able to move towards that. But they're also able to move towards poor water quality as well. When we placed a vial of aqueous hydrogen sulfide, it's a noxious olfactory compound that smells like rotten eggs that causes immersion in a lot of amphibious fishes because it is a toxic, noxious compound. These fish move significantly away from it. So from a distance, they can tell both positive and negative negative water quality and move accordingly and orient accordingly. We also tested foil to see how they orient on land with respect to vision. And we had foil over here, and they significantly moved away from the foil. So this suggests that they are definitely using vision on land in some capacity, but they're using different visual cues or perhaps worse visual acuity than killifish on land. And so they may be moving away from foil because it's an unknown object, or because they're, let's say, not trying to go towards the water. Maybe they're trying to move away from water. So these fish have different motivations on land than killifish. Here's an example of walking catfish moving around on land. They don't always move in the direction that they're facing when they start. This just happens to be facing the pond water. And you can see right before it moves and while it's moving, it's wiggling its whiskers around. And it's trying to actively feel the environment and get sensory information from the environment. I'll show you one more time. Just watch the whiskers wiggling around, and then it moves, and it's wiggling while they move. So walking catfish have stereotype barbel position when they land. They have their mental or chin barbels against the substrate, and their maxillary, the longer barbels, spread out wide. And by doing so, they can perhaps increase their receptive area on land and be able to get more information from their environment. They also have their nasal barbels, the dorsalmost barbels, up in the air. And in my experience catfishing for dozens of catfish species, most catfish just have their barbels adhere to the skin when they come out of the water, just stuck to their mucus layer, whereas these ones are actively have their barbels up in the air, which may help them sample free stream air, allowing them to better detect airborne compounds. So overall, this is the first evidence of terrestrial orientation by chemoreception in a live fish. I say live fish because there was a Russian study that showed orientation by aerial olfaction. It may be possible in oceanic white-tip sharks by putting a shark head on a pole, a dead shark head on a pole, and putting up and down in the water, which showed that Yep, their nostrils hold air bubbles in the water. Therefore, they can use smell out of the water and use that to orient to find whale carcasses floating around. So it's a pretty big leap. And so I feel confident in saying that I have the first evidence of terrestrial orientation by chemoreception in a live fish. They're definitely using taste as their strong response to alanine, which is a taste compound. And they may be using this for terrestrial feeding. Perhaps they're detecting amino acids on land from, let's say, worms and other terrestrial invertebrates in a semi-flooded environment, and they can follow those taste trails to the prey. They're also using vision, but we're not quite sure how they're using vision to orient on land. Just know that vision is part of their terrestrial orientation. And they're able to detect airborne compounds, which they can use to find bodies of water and discriminate from good bodies of water from bad bodies of water based on the volatile compounds. Now, how do they detect airborne compounds? It could be smell, like that Russian study suggested, with their nostrils, but they're not able to ventilate their nostrils on air, so they're not able to get new air in there. And so smell is likely not working through the nostrils. They are able to ventilate the air-breathing organ, though. They have special fans in there. So perhaps there are olfactory receptors in this organ that could be used for navigation and orientation. But this has not been confirmed, and olfactory receptors are generally confined to the olfactory bulb and the olfactory epithelium. Now, the barbels have extraoral taste buds, and a recent study found functional olfactory receptors on mammalian taste buds. So it's possible that fish also have functional olfactory receptors on their taste buds, but this also has not been confirmed, so this would need to be looked into to make this conclusion. Alternatively, I'm thinking they use aerial taste and nociception for terrestrial orientation for 3 key reasons. They have extraoral taste buds and nociceptors. Here you can clearly see the taste buds through a scanning electron microscope image. Right here is one, and here are 2 more. So these are on the outside of the whiskers, which they can move around. And now you need a moist epithelium to detect for chemoreception, and these fish are coated in mucus, so their taste buds on their whiskers are coated in mucus and should be able to taste. And their barbels are innervated by the trigeminal and facial nerves, but not by the olfactory nerve. This means that they're equipped with the nerves that will transmit nociception and taste information to the brain, but not smell information. So this further suggests that they're using both aerial taste and nociception and not smell. So overall, invasive fishes will emerge during the rain, when water conditions are poor, or for reasons we don't understand yet. And they can effectively move over land using a variety of different ways. They can find and disperse new bodies of overland, but they can also take advantage of man-made structures for dispersal, like the storm drain system. They may come out of storm drains when it floods, disperse over land, and then return to new bodies of water. Now, because they can spread over land, underground, through water, it can breathe and survive out of water long periods of time, and they know where they're going, and they'll voluntarily come on land. This makes containing invasive amphibious fishes much more difficult than just regular invasive species. Therefore, we need to amend range expansion models, risk assessments, and management plans to include this information to treat them more like amphibians for the sake of management rather than your typical fish. Now, my research goals were to figure out, why do amphibious fishes go onto land? We found that snakeheads will go onto land when water quality is poor, and walking catfish will go on land when it rains, but also for reasons we don't understand yet. And there's a bunch of other species we still don't understand. How do they move around on land? Snakeheads will crawl and jump. The mangrove rivulets will also jump. And you also have weirdos like the plecos that ruffle and do something completely different, but it's just as effective at moving on land, if not better than the others. Now, where do they go on land and how do they orient? We found that they use vision. The killifish use vision using a variety of visual cues to find their way around the land, as well as the otolith vestibular system to find their way around on a slope, and also found that catfish use chemoreception on land. I'd like to thank everyone who made this research possible, particularly my advisor, Dr. Miriam Ashley Ross, for all of her support and enabling me to do all these crazy, wacky projects that were just awesome. I'd like to thank my committee members for teaching me a bunch of valuable new skills that I was able to apply to this research. I'd like to thank my collaborators, Jeff Hill, Joe Love, Stacy Farina, and Ben Perlman for their help with these projects. I also like thank my lab mates for keeping me sane and helping me practice and give me feedback on all my presentations and projects throughout the years. This research would not have been possible or would have taken way longer if it wasn't for the help of all the undergrads and high school students to help me analyze my data. I'd also like to thank Drs. Ryan Early, Bruce Turner, and everyone at the University of Florida Tropical Aquaculture Lab and the Cedarville State Forest Maryland Department of Natural Resources Lab for their help providing animal care, and lab space. I would not have been able to do it without their help with these invasive species. I'd like to thank everyone in the Facebook groups that responded to the survey, particularly Mark Benson and Andrew Nissip for their particularly detailed responses. I'd like to thank Drs. John Caprio, Jake Saunders, Wayne Silver, and Sam Ben Wassenberg for their sensory biology insight when doing the Walking Catfish project. I'd also like to thank NSF, the crowdsourcing campaign through Animal Superpowers Project Experiment.com, the Wake Forest Biology Department, the Vichelio Fund, and Friday Harbor Labs for funding my research. I'd like to thank my friends and family for their support and keeping me sane and from losing my mind during all this research and crazy things that are happening. And especially my lovely girlfriend, Alicia Miller, who when I tore my shoulder and had to do field work in 3 weeks, she followed all of my detailed instruction for multiple hours on end to build these experimental setups. And I really appreciate her manual labor in that. And of course, I got to thank fish for being so awesome, because otherwise I'd start something like birds or I don't know. And I shall now unmute it and be happy to answer questions once I figure out where, there we go. And participants, unmute all. Okay, I'll be happy to answer any questions that people may have.
Can you unshare your screen, Noah,
yes,
so we can see you?
Yes.
Great.
Here we are, and I'll make the questions now. Well, so there is one question that already somebody posted. It says, do you think the knowledge, it's by Catherine, it says, do you think the knowledge of substrate affecting movement could help water body managers to limit the spread of the invasive snakehead? If so, which substrate would you recommend for managers? Are there any native amphibious fishes this could negatively affect? I'm actually writing a review paper on this topic right now. So it seems like that because like they move better on more natural substrates like grass and three-dimensional substrates, but on like flat stone surfaces, snakeheads don't move as well. And so you could, so in places with artificial canals that have concrete edges, they may not be able to move as well over that land, and they won't be able to disperse as well. Now that being said, I'm not sure we want to bulldoze all of our riparian zones and replace them with concrete, but it is something to consider in perhaps high-risk areas where there's a lot of, let's say, endemic species or a vulnerable ecosystem. In this area, the only other amphibious fish I know in the Potomac River region is mummy chug, and those are mostly amphibious in like marshes and intertidal zone, so I don't think this would affect them that much. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer any other questions. If there are any other questions?
No, while you give people a moment to think of them, why don't you tell everybody what you're going to be doing after this?
Okay, so once I figure out when I'm legally allowed to move, given the pandemic, I will be moving to California, working at Chapman University with Dr. Doug Fudge. I'll be working both out of Chapman University in Orange County, as well as a remote lab in Moss Landing, California, right on Monterey Bay. And I'll be working on hagfish slime and trying to see if it's possible to use hagfish slime to stop, I'm trying to use hagfish slime to see if we can stop small boat propellers from moving at high speeds while on land. So to see if like you can just basically use a slime cannon to shoot at the propeller to see if you can stop the boat safely. So let's see, wait, I've muted everyone. Let's see, unmute all. All participants are unmuted, it says now. So I think now you can unmute yourself maybe?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Not forgive me if this is incredibly naive, as I am not a fish biologist. I'm wondering if the differences in terrestrial locomotion that you saw in those two fish that you had side by side, the one doing sort of the tail flip back and forth and the other one using its pectoral fins. Is that the right? Anyway.
Yeah.
Are those differences in terrestrial locomotion related to their in water locomotion? Like, do they tend to rely on the same muscle groups on land that they do when they're swimming, or like do fish swim differently?
So, yeah, so some fish do swim differently. You have fish like eels that have really they have really big undulations where they get their whole body involved, and they can basically just slither on land like a snake. You also have stuff on the other end that are really restricted, like tuna, that are oscillatory and they move very restricted. But you on land, this could be based on some of the species on how they swim. You have some fish that like sculpins that move on the ground underwater, and plecos also do a walking behavior on the ground underwater, and so they would do a walking behavior with their pelvic fins, and so they may modify their aquatic behaviors to suit their terrestrial behaviors.
Cool, thank you.
You're welcome. We got a question from Kate Galloway. Wait, first there was a question before that, but let's see. Could climate change, by Catherine, could climate change affect the rates of amphibious fish movements? I asked because you showed concentration of CO2 could affect movement. And so climate change could affect the rates of amphibious fish movement. And I think particularly because right now in Florida, you have the walking catfish are like just below the panhandle based on their lower lethal temperature. So the temperature north of that, it gets too cold for them to survive the winter and they will die. But as the temperature increases, they could perhaps just get over that panhandle and then spread west and rapidly increase their range. As with CO2 causing them to emerge, they will, as CO2 causing them to emerge, it probably doesn't have a big effect on them because vegetation and decomposition has much greater rates of affecting small lake and river systems. Whereas the ocean is much more long-term stable and is affected by like the long-term atmospheric carbon dioxide. We got a question from Kate Galloway that says, are snakeheads affecting populations of bowfin fish? I have heard that people commonly mistake bowfins for snakeheads. Is that true and a problem for bowfins? It actually is a problem for bowheads. I'm not sure if there's strong research on how it affects their population, but snakeheads kind of look like bowheads, and so people, when trying to kill invasive species, they kill a lot of these native bowfin fish. And so we need to educate anglers a little better about discerning these two species. Okay, are there any more questions? Did I fix the mute problem? If not, you can also type the questions into the Zoom group chat and I can read them out.
Noah, I have a question.
Yes.
I was really interested in this red mussel on the armored catfish that is helping them move on land. I was wondering if you noticed in your trials if that was a limiting factor in how long they could stay out of water. Because I'm wondering, with the oxygenation of that red mussel, after a while that might run out, or like how much of that is dedicated to this pectoral fin movement. So I was just wondering if you noticed any trends in how far or how long they could go out of water using these pectoral muscles, or did they give up using the pectoral muscles before they gave up on any other muscle group in the movement?
So I couldn't really tell which muscles they're giving up on. It was more of, I would put them on the ground, I would wait until they stopped moving, and then I would keep poking them until they kept moving. And then once they stopped moving to the pokes, then I'm like, okay, they're not gonna move anymore. So I don't really know which muscles they are, but you can see, it seems like they're actually axial body. Their white muscle may slow down a little bit more, as in some that have that have gone several strides in. They stop doing as dramatic of tail sweeping motions, and like their tail's moving very little, and they seem to be just relying on their pelvic fin, pectoral fin in their mouth. Any other questions? See, Bill Connor. Oh, let's see. It's not letting me unmute people. Everyone should be unmuted. Seems like Bill's trying to say a question and same Scott's trying to, So it's not letting me unmute. So please just type the question into the, oh, there it is. I guess I had to allow you to unmute and then you can unmute. Okay. So somebody have a question?
Noah.
Yes.
Bill.
Hi.
I wanted to, have you ever analyzed the movement patterns of the fish in addition to just where they end up?
What do you mean, but
Turning rates?
Okay.
When they move from alanine to non-alanine, do they respond?
So I have one interesting thing to note about those treatments and their movement patterns. So I exclude a lot of the treatments. I had to exclude even more than, let's say, half the individuals, just because they didn't move or they didn't move enough to get out of the extra test area. And their patterns didn't seem that different in all the treatments, except in the AITC treatment. Not a single one was a dud. They all moved. So perhaps in the AITC, they may not be orienting a specific direction to that. They may just be trying to get away from it because it's unpleasant and they're just trying to move away from it. So that's the only pattern that I really noticed that was different. Any other questions? All right, thank you. Guess that's that.
Yay, Noah.
Oh wait, there's one more question I just got. It says, do you think slope preference may be a function of ease based on locomotion ability? And I think that's partially true. Yeah, I think it's just easier to move downhill. So they may be moving downhill just because it's easier. I think it's also a little combination of some fish, so I've seen some fish will move uphill as well. And so it seems like that moving downhill is easier and it gets them to water. But perhaps some individuals that aren't trying to get to water may move uphill and do the effort to go uphill. Okay, yep, so that's the last question. Thanks to everybody for attending, and I'll do my private defense shortly, I guess.